So I had the opportunity to discuss some Q&A with class, with my in-person class, and wanted to just highlight some of the major questions that some of the students had, just to make sure that in the event that any of you are also running into similar issues, you know, some of these are easy to fix. Got a sample image here. Now, one thing that can often occur if you're using the pen tool is if you maybe aren't a hotkey user and you start using the pen tool to maybe place in some points, but maybe you switch tools, you rearrange, maybe maybe your path gets deselected at some point, and you start back up where you started. Sometimes what can occur is you may have two separate paths. So in this case, I've got the one that's taking care of the side of her face, and I've got one down here that's her neck. And if I move them around, you can actually see these are two completely separate paths. They're not attached in any way. They might look like they are, depending on how close that they are positioned to one another, but if you look, and I'm zooming way in, you can see that these are actually not connected. Even if I were to physically overlap them to where they look like they're connected, if you select it and zoom back out, if you select it and parts of your path that you know you created are not highlighting, you can't see the points, this means that you may have run into a situation where you need to attach all of the path portions to one another. Fortunately, this is a pretty easy fix. I click on my pen tool and I'll select one of these, separate them a little bit just to make it a little easier to see. Using the pen tool, I will come to one of the ends of either of those, and you can see that my cursor, if I don't have anything near a path, it'll act like I'm going to start a new path, and it's got a little asterisk next to my cursor. But when I hover over the end of a path, you can see that it looks like one of the square points with a little bit of a path on either side. This means I am reconnecting to that current path. I'm reconnecting to it, and I can continue on. Now, if I come to the edge of another path, you can see same thing. I'm running into where it says, all right, I'm connecting these two paths together. If I click, you can see my points have disappeared, but if I select, now both of those paths are connected to one another. And then at that point, you can remove points that aren't necessary, oops, or perhaps rearrange points in order to use them. Keeping in mind, you can always add or remove points from a current path. So if you're overcompensating or decide that there is a point that you need to incorporate someplace, you can always add it to a path that's already current. So once I've produced a completed path, and I remained relatively general here, not too much information. I did make some overlap up here in the hair region just because you can see bits of her skin through the wispy little bits of bangs that she does have displaying. At that point, I'm going to load her path as a selection. I've got her face path listed here, as well as some other paths that I've created. And I'm going to, I can load it as a selection in a couple different ways. I can select the path in question, right click, and tell it to make a selection, I can come down here and tell it to load a path as a selection. It's the little icon that looks like a dotted circle, essentially. Think the marching ants. I can also highlight, and this shows up while I've got the pen tool selected. I can highlight that path and tell it to make a selection from there also. Now, I gave you all like a specific set of directions if you're wanting to do the extra credit portion of the assignment. Part of the reason that I gave you that is because just applying any old color to the skin, while this can meet the assignment's requirements to some degrees, it's very flat looking, it's very plastic, it's not realistic in that there's not a lot of variety of tone. Part of the reason that I give the realistic skin tone option as extra credit is because regardless of your ethnicity, if you take a look at your skin, you know, your hands, your face, you're going to see bits of different colors. You might have veins close to the surface that will show you know, a little bit of blue or green. You might have pinker areas and more yellow areas and more olive green areas, and regardless of how fair-skinned or dark-skinned you are, everyone's going to have some variety. It's not a flat color. So rather than picking just a flat color like I've done here, which, you know, isn't as clean and finessed looking as it could be, I'm going to pick a series of colors that we can alter further. So to do this, you're going to pick red, green, red, yellow, and blue, the primary colors. So I'm going to pick a color, blue. I'm happy with these. I'll call it blue. I'll right click and duplicate my layer. The next one will be red. I'll call it red. Right click, duplicate layer. The top one will be yellow. And then I'll make that one yellow. Now, 3 separate colors, all taking up the same amount of space. This is where the masks come into play. Because as it is, she looks yellow, sunburnt, and like a Smurf. And none of those are going to help. It's the combination of the 3 when the masks are altered. So I'm going to grab my paintbrush tool. Just like with the first assignment, you want to lower your opacity. So I'm going to pick something around 10-15%. The backdrop is where the mask isn't affecting. So I'm going to paint black into the white area with my paintbrush tool. And as I start to paint, you can see that she starts to look a little bit more lifelike, a little bit less flat yellow. If I overdo it, she can start to look sunburnt or like she has a bad spray tan, but there's more going on here. And if you take a look at the mask, you can see that there's bits of gray where I'm painting out the yellow and showing the red that's beneath it. Again, take into consideration what happens on one layer will affect the layer beneath or above it depending on the way that their layers are set up. So if I wanted to give her rosy lips, I could paint more of the yellow out and show more of the red of underneath. Okay. If I wanted to show a little bit of blue beneath the red, maybe for the shadows, there are some areas that might be a little bit cooler because they're in shadow, I might go in and the blue's just going to darken it a little bit. Just a touch, not a lot. If I do too much blue, let me find my history state here. Too much blue, she'll start to look ill or undead or Bride of Frankenstein-ish. So you don't want to overdo it on the red layer. And the blue layer you shouldn't need to alter really at all, because the blue is just there to add additional color. You shouldn't need to edit that mask. So for organization's sake, I'll make a group for their skin, all those layers. I'll highlight all of them, put them in the skin group. That kind of covers it. Now, obviously, I've been very brief. I would maybe whiten the whites of her eyes, color her eyes a little bit more, that sort of thing. But that basically gives you the idea. In relation to the way that those masks together can give you a much more realistic end product for the skin tones versus the, you know, the flesh tone general color. Now, switch back over to my paths. I've got a path that I've created for her hair. I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing. Load her as a selection. Come over here to hue and saturation. And based on the photo, it looks like she'd probably have darker hair. So I might tinker with the layers a little bit. And maybe a little dark. Apply some sort of effect to color in her hair. Now, a couple things happen here right off the bat, visually. One, the path around her head's giving sort of a helmet head appearance. It's very sharp. Hair doesn't do that, especially not with all these little flyaways. It just doesn't work. So I might refine my mask to just smooth it out a little bit, feather the edges a touch. Oops. There we go. So you can see how soft those edges are now. So that gets me started. And I could go in and hand touch up some of these edges that maybe I colored too much out of the lines. So I might go in with my brush. At this point you could raise the opacity again, shrink the brush, and just clean up around the edges where perhaps it's not really looking the way it ought to. Just little bits. But the bigger issue is where the skin and the hair meet. You can see that there's some orange going on in some of those areas where the skin and the hair overlap. All right. This is a really great opportunity to use an effect over everything that's inside of the group, because the group is controlling the skin tones. One of the nice things about newer versions of Photoshop that weren't available previously is that you can apply a mask to a group. So I can actually mask out everything inside of that group without having to go in by hand and edit each one of those face masks individually, which is way easier than it used to be. Before, the way you'd have to do it is you'd have to go in and physically alter each one of these individually in order to prevent that. Photoshop has made it a lot simpler. At this point. Now for little wispy hairs, and I would need to go in and fix this on a couple masks. You can do this by hand, these little wispy hairs, but you'd want a much smaller brush, and it's kind of hard to do with a mouse. I mean, it can be done, but it's a pain to do it. Fortunately, you don't have as much flyaways in the photo that I provided you for the assignment as this particular photo does, so you're in luck in that case. One of the students in my physical class did ask, you know, what's the best way to go about that type of editing if they wanted to do it, or, you know, if the image applied to it. And I suggested looking into getting a Wacom tablet. What a Wacom tablet is, and I'll switch to a new document in this case. What a Wacom tablet is it is a pressure-sensitive digital tablet that comes with a stylus or a pen that lets you physically alter the way that an object works in terms of pressure sensitivity. So with a mouse, and I've got my mouse right now, it's on or off. I can make it make whatever shape I want, but there's no variety in relation to the way that the, you know, it's 100% to 0% in terms of the way that the paintbrush works with a mouse. With a stylus, it's all based off of pressure sensitivity. So if you have a stylus and you press very delicately, shape dynamics are turned to pen pressure, as is color, meaning if I press lightly, it's going to give me a light. If I start to press harder, it will press harder, and you can see that if I press very light, it's giving me a thin line. If I start to press heavier, it's going to give me a thick line. So in relation to using something like this to deal with flyaways, I would be able to have a lot more control over what these little thin, wispy hairs ended up doing. So I'd get a lot more control over what the end product was, and it's like tracing a drawing with tracing paper. Now you can see my mask is updating, but I'm still getting that like kind of funky orange. An easy way to adjust that would be to add the mask to the selection, come on over to my other mask, and hit delete or backspace, and it will update this mask to match this one. So you can see that some of those hairs are starting to show now. Now this isn't perfect. There's lots of extra work that I would do here, but it's starting to be, you know, go in the right direction in relation to color. The last thing that I'd like to show you in relation to paths, and I'll give this another go. In the event that you're wanting to paint one region and have another region match it. In this case, like you can see her shirt is split up into 3 separate pieces. Her vest, assuming that's what that is split up into 2 pieces. There's a bow on the left side and on the right side of her head. She's got 2 eyes, etc. Now, if you're not careful and you go to make a selection of an object, whatever that happens to be, we'll say her eye, double click, call it the eye. If you deselect that, meaning it's no longer highlighted in blue, and you try to make another selection, you can see that it's going to create a whole nother work path. So now I've got 2 eyes on a separate layer entirely, which isn't what I want. But if you highlight a path that's already been built and add to it, you can see that now I've got two little dots there, meaning both of the eyes can be loaded at one time rather than at separate times. So that makes it much easier for you to make sure that both sides, or different things that are related to one another, whether it's fabric or clothing or other stuff, you can make sure that it matches and you're not, you know, going into the adjustment layer and writing down hues 229, saturation is 25, lightness is 0, and then hoping you don't type in a mistake and everything matches. So it does make it a little bit easier. Now, should you do something like that and realize, oh my gosh, I broke it, you can always take a path and merge paths together. So the way to do this is I might grab my path selection tool, click on one and then shift click on the other, edit, cut, removes the path. You can see the eye one is empty. I could come to, maybe I want her hair and her eyes to match, come to the hair layer, edit, paste. They paste right in the same location, but you can see it's now a part of the same path. So that makes it a little easier for you to correct problems where maybe you accidentally separated many pieces of the same object and don't want to run into a problem trying to combine the colors together. So I will post some additional resources online in relation to a Wacom tablet in the event any of you would be interested. So I hope I answered some questions. I know that this type of lecture did help the in-person class that I teach as well for Photoshop. I will also, in the event any of you are interested in learning how to use a Wacom tablet or maybe researching purchasing one, if like digital illustration, having pressure sensitivity is something that you're interested in, I will post some resources in the discussion boards outlining that as well. If you have any questions, please feel free to field them to me, and if it's something I think many students could perhaps benefit from, I will share it in the discussion boards or as a video, depending on the question. Otherwise, best of luck, and I look forward to seeing what you all come up with.